broadcast. Hello everybody and welcome to another BVNA webinar. People are just coming into the Zoom room and I'm just attempting, there we go, we are now live on Facebook as well. Fantastic. So we're live on the BVNA Facebook page. Welcome everybody to another of our Wednesday evening webinars. People are coming into the room, so welcome everybody. Just to make sure you get the best out of a webinar this evening, just a few top tips. If you have any audio problems, sometimes this can be if you're connected on Wi-Fi. So if you're able to connect wired, then that may improve. But if not, there is the option to dial in on the telephone. Depending on what device you're joined on, we can select the audio option and dial in on the telephone. We have a chat box as well. If you have any questions, please just type those into the chat box. I'll be monitoring that chat box during the presentation this evening, and we will have time to go over as many of your questions as we can at the end of the session. This evening, I'm joined by Joe Hyde, current president of BVNA, who will be chairing this session for me this evening. So I will hand over to Joe and I will mute myself while I battle with Facebook. Over to you, Joe.
Great, thanks ever so much, Wendy. And thanks everyone for joining us this evening for what promises to be another great BVNA webinar. I'm very proud to introduce Nikki Ackerley, who is our speaker this evening. Nikki's the owner of HR Support Consultancy. She's got a BA Honours in Business Studies, is a member of the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, and has been practicing HR manager for more than 20 years. HR Support Consultancy has provided the BVNA advisory service since it began in 2002, and through the COVID period, Nikki has been and her colleagues have been exceptionally busy, dealing with sometimes over 100 calls a day. So thank you very much, Nikki. We're very much looking forward to hearing about how to navigate redundancy. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Joe, and welcome everybody to this evening's webinar on navigating redundancy. This is really about the legal position, the processes, and the responsibilities. Now, it won't come as any surprise to you that we have seen an increase in the past month on the number of callers ringing about redundancy, an unfortunate aftermath of the coronavirus situation that we've been facing. However, we've also, on a more positive note, had a lot of calls from people who are looking to change their job. So it's not all doom and gloom in the veterinary nursing world. So there are still lots of vacancies and people do still seem to be moving from one job to another. So let me start with the first slide. So if we can put up the slide, please, on the legal position. Redundancy is just one way of terminating the employment relationship. There could be many other ways of terminating the employment relationship. You could resign, or you could be dismissed, or it might be the end of, say, a fixed-term contract. So there is legal protection for people who are going through a redundancy process. And to have that legal protection, unless you are suffering with a disability or an equality situation, then to have protection under Employment Rights Act, you must have 2 years service. The redundancy process is the responsibility of the employer to get this correct. So let's start off with some of the basic facts. Employees under 40 with 2 years service are entitled to 1 week's redundancy pay per completed number of years service. So that's somebody with under the age of 40 with 2 years service, you'll get 1 week's redundancy pay for every year you have completed in that workplace. Have the next slide, please. Employees who are over 40 with 2 years service can claim 1.5 weeks pay per number of completed years service. And the redundancy pay per week is capped at £535. Your employer cannot exceed this. So if you're in a higher earning bracket, you wouldn't get any more than £535. Your average pay per week will be used, and it may be considerably less than £535. So that's the basic legal position of what you could expect. In addition, you could also receive payment for notice, but you might be required to work your notice. So it won't necessarily be an additional lump sum. And during the current furlough situation, you can be served notice whilst you are furloughed. But if that happens, you are to expect 100% and not 80%, or on the sliding scale that's going to take effect from the end of July, you could expect definitely to get 100% whilst you're serving your notice. Okay, next slide, please. So, on this slide, what we have is the consultation process. This is vitally important in a situation where there is redundancy. So on the left here, on this slide in blue, there are the numbers of affected employees. These are the people that would leave at the end of the redundancy process. So what we have to do within a consultation process is decide in the first instance how many redundancies there are likely to be per legal entity. That's really important for those of you who work in large corporates, because we have to establish in the first instance what a legal entity is. So it will depend, if you're a member of a group, whether those are separate legal entities or whether they're one legal entity. And it's described in law as an establishment. So if those companies have more joint finances, they are more likely to be one establishment. So if there are 200 practices within your group in the UK, then you might go over 20 of the numbers to be made redundant. If you're an independent and it's 5 people that are potentially affected by redundancy, then it makes a big difference to the consultation timetable. So let me just recap on that, because it's a really important point, but it's quite a tricky point to get across. The number of affected people to leave is dependent on the number of people in the establishment. So if you've got 5 or 6 practices or 200 practices and the number goes over 20 across those practices, as long as they have joint finances, then you will likely get into a longer consultation process. If you're a small independent and you're making 3 or 4 people redundant, then you will likely be under 20 potentially affected employees. So if you are under 20 potentially affected employees, there's a consultation process required, and the definition in employment law is that it should be reasonable. But it's usually up to 15 days to consult with less than 20 people. Over 20 people, but less than 99 people to be made redundant, not the people at risk, the people that will leave at the end, there is legal requirement to do a 30-day consultation. And the HR function, or the practice manager, or the owner will have to complete an HR1 form prior to the first dismissal. If there are more than those numbers in the one establishment, then it's important that the practices set up an employee representative group. That's a legal requirement if you're making over 20, less than 99 employees redundant. If you're making over 100 redundancies, then there's a requirement legally to do a 45-day consultation. And again, the completion of this HR1 form, which notifies the government how many jobs are to be lost. So, if you have repeated redundancy exercises, so you do 10 this month and 10 the next month, within a 90-day period, then those repeated exercises come to the total of 20, 20 to 99, or over 100. These numbers include fixed-term contractors who are terminated early and any volunteers within the scheme. So this week, I've been dealing with 2 practices amongst many others. One was part of a group and had another site 16 miles along the road, and one was closing down, and the other was taking some of those staff to work in the second practice. So that is all part of the consultation process, and those nurses learnt that one practice was staying open and the work from the closing practice was being consolidated into one practice, and yet they had been 16 miles apart. So it's very important when something like that happens that during this consultation period, one of the things that will be considered is, are there reasonable alternative roles nearby? And the definition of what is reasonable is for the employee who is being potentially made redundant to make a decision on whether they think it's reasonable and negotiate with the practice whether they think it's okay to travel 16 miles or not to travel 16 miles. Next slide, please. If you're affected by potential redundancy, the business needs to provide a statement to you on the very first day explaining the business reason for redundancy. That can be an economical reason, a technical reason, or an organisational reason. The period of furlough for many, many organisations across the UK, not just veterinary ones, has given people consideration of how to be more efficient. So it might be that there's a need to improve efficiency and reduce the number of staff. Right at the start of the process, as well as the business explanation, should be a timetable, and the timetable will be followed strictly. Did deal with somebody this week who was in a predicament because they had been put at risk of redundancy and then there had been no communication for 3 weeks. That is not an acceptable consultation process. An employer has a duty at the start of this consultation process to let everybody who might be affected know as soon as they know. But we all know in reality the business has to consider their finances, what the business should look like in the future, and therefore what they need to achieve in their business restructure. So though that's the law, there's no specific timetable to it. They have to be reasonable and tell you as quickly as they are able. However, once they start this process, they should adopt a reasonable timetable. Now the next part is determining the pools of who are and are not affected. So a pool is a group of people. It might be a pool of people who work on the night shift because we're going to reduce the night shift. It could be a pool of all the student nurses. It could be a pool of all the support staff. It might be a pool of all of the nurses with more than 2 years registered experience. It's up to the owner of the business to determine the pools. Then what will happen is everybody who's in the pool, so let's say for example we've got a pool of 10 nurses and we're going to lose 3 of those nurses. Then we will issue an at-risk letter with details of the notice pay and the redundancy pay if they have 2 years service, of who is to be made redundant, and everyone in that group of 10 will receive that at-risk letter. And then there will be consultation meetings with the people in that pool. Now, it is normal that during that consultation process, everybody should have 2 additional meetings. So you get told on day 1 you're at risk, and then you have 2 further meetings on your own, privately, with the people who are making the decisions about the pool and why the redundancy is necessary. This will allow affected employees to take a colleague with them to discuss the consultation, or have consultation with an employee representative group if we're talking about the larger numbers at risk. Continue the redundancy or notifying the people in the pool until they are no longer at risk. And on the final day, so you've had the introduction day, you've had the 2 consultation meetings, and then you have a final day with the people in the pool to let them know that they are at risk and they are leaving, or they are no longer at risk. So in our pool of 10, if 2 are to leave, the 8 will be told their jobs are no longer at risk. Then what you're entitled to is an appeal process. We'll talk shortly about the selection criteria process. But if you feel that you have been treated unfairly and you have been made redundant, you think the process is flawed or your selection is flawed, then you have the right of appeal. Most organisations, because it's good practice, also have a voluntary redundancy process that runs in tandem. I'm going to talk more about this later, but in essence, the business can decide whether volunteers are acceptable or not. Okay, next slide, please. Ultimately, if you appealed and your appeal was not overturned, then you have the right to go and make a claim to an employment tribunal. You only have that right if you have 2 years service, or if you think the Equality Act has been breached, i.e. if you have a disability, or if you were selected for redundancy because, say, for example, you were pregnant. So you have ultimately got a remedy to an employment tribunal about a failure to follow a good process and a failure if you have been unequally treated under the Equality Act. Next slide, please. Selection criteria. When anybody is considering redundancy, the selection criteria are key. And it needs to be shared with the employees during that consultation, usually at the first meeting when the announcement is made, or at the first individual consultation meeting. The selection criteria is the process by which employees in the pool, these 10 nurses, are compared to each other. The selection criteria can be put together by the business employer, or they might take some input from the staff who are in the pool as well. That's their choice. Everybody in the pool will be scored against the criteria, and it's good practice to have 2 people scoring every individual in the pool. Obviously, it will depend on the size of the practice, but then there's no bias from one person or another, and those scores can be averaged. You have the right to see your score, and you have the right to see the scores of other people in the pool, but they'll be anonymised. So you won't know who the person above you and below you were. You'll just know that you were one of the ones, unfortunately, who were selected for redundancy. The one above you might have been safe, and the one below you will have less points scored than you. So it's vitally important that you understand what the selection criteria is, and that you can check your score, and that you can ask for justification for why you've scored higher or lower in each of the criteria. If we go to the next slide, here are just one example of selection criteria. So we have the points on the left-hand side. And it's really difficult for an employer to quantify against some of the criteria. So if you just had somebody is not a good team player, and that was you, you would have the right to challenge, why are you saying I'm not a good team player? So it's better to have the criteria selected that can be quantified. And here we've got an example of selection criteria that can have some quantifiable aspect. So if I just said to somebody, the quantity of the work you do is not as good as the next person, they will say, well, justify yourself, Nikki. So how I would score that particular criteria of quantity of work would be a score of 1, so produces minimum acceptable quantity of work and is a slow worker, through to 4, somebody who produces high quality work and consistently above that is normally expected. So hopefully from that you can see some differential. If we look at ability in the current job, the person scoring the lowest would be ability limited to a few specific jobs and often given easier tasks, through to the person who's going to score the highest in this selection would be high ability, regular given tasks, too difficult for other people to cope with. Let's have a look at relationships, because they are sometimes difficult to quantify. So you might only score 1 if you are described as difficult to deal with and requires careful handling and persuasion to gain full cooperation. And I completely understand. Most people wouldn't want to hear that. So it's very important that they can substantiate that comment. Through to the person scoring the highest in this criteria, someone who's extremely willing, always seeking out ways to improve, and will pitch in without being asked. So you get the picture. Here we've got 5 different criteria, and we're scoring them between 1 and 4. So you could either score 20 on this matrix, or you could score 5. It's as simple as that. And so the person, regrettably, who scores 5 is much more likely to leave than the person who was lucky enough to score 20. Quite often people talk about selection criteria and say absence can be included. That is not good HR practice, because you might have somebody who's got higher than the average days absence because they've got a disability. And we can't discriminate against somebody because of a disability. We might also see organisations where the selection criteria includes disciplinary action, previous disciplinary action, and they might score negative points for that. Again, that is frowned upon as good selection criteria because the person's already been given a sanction for the reason that they had the disciplinary action. So best practice, again, says don't include disciplinary because they've already had that sanction. So if you are regrettably being in the pool and the selection criteria include absence or they include disciplinary, I would certainly consider challenging that as not best practice for selection criteria. I hope this slide on selection criteria is clear, but as always, please do come back to us if you have any specifics. This is just an example. Have the next slide, please. I mentioned earlier about voluntary redundancy. The practice may ask for volunteers, but they are not bound to accept volunteers. So if they needed to keep the most highly skilled set of nursing staff, those that could work in theatre, had additional qualifications, could use all of the anaesthetic equipment, had a specific skill set, let's say in reptiles or equine, something that was specifically needed by the practice, and a volunteer came forward from that group, the practice could say, no, you are not acceptable as a volunteer. Because ultimately, the selection for redundancy is based on the business need. And it is highly likely they will not want to let go their most skilled staff in specific fields. So it's for them to determine right at the beginning in that statement as to what skill set they are looking for and what they want the practice to focus on in the future. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? During the whole process of this redundancy, whether that's 30 days or 15 days or 45 days, then all of the people in the affected pool should be offered any alternative roles. So if somebody unwittingly, let's say the redundancy was on the night shift, they were, let's say, closing the night shift, but a vacancy became available on the day shift, then that's a reasonable alternative role. And as I mentioned earlier, it's for the employer and the employee to consider those alternative roles, and for perhaps the nurse to consider that a move from the night shift onto the day shift was reasonable. Maybe their lifestyle won't accommodate that, and they will have to justify why, therefore, it is not reasonable that they take that vacancy on the day shift. If you do try an alternative role, then you have the right to a trial for 30 days, and if you don't like the job on the alternative shift, then you can put in the claim that it was only a trial for the alternative role for 30 days, and you revert back to redundancy. It's not a bad idea to trial an alternative role because it gives you a little bit of breathing space, it gives the practice some help and support for a little bit longer. But if ultimately you do not want to work on anything but nights, for example, it might give you an additional 30 days to go and seek a new job working on the night shift. Next slide, please. At the end of this consultation period, then you should receive confirmation of redundancy. So this is you've had the at-risk letter detailing what redundancy pay, if any, you're entitled to, and what notice pay you'll be entitled to. And this redundancy confirmation letter will confirm all of that, and it will also confirm if your notice is to be paid and what your final day in the building will be, or whether you're required to work it. So you may be required to work all or some of your notice. So there is a difference between what your last day of work is and the date that you are made redundant. Today I'm telling you your job is going to be made redundant. That's the 15th of July. But actually I want you to carry on working for 3 months. So your final day of work is not the 15th of July, it's the 15th of October. And in that confirmation of redundancy, there must be an appeal process for the employment law to be valid around this selection of redundancy. And you could appeal on your scoring against the selection criteria and challenge, but make sure you do it with facts and be able to substantiate it, why you think you should have been scored higher in one of those criteria. Next slide, please. We are asked a lot about apprentices, and we're asked a lot about student nurses, and it's really important that you liaise with the college, and it will depend on the agreement that you have with the college, and some are different. So it's often a tripartite agreement, and the responsibilities around funding and how the student's been funded and the year the student is in will have a bearing on the outcome. So it's really important, if you have a student who is regrettably going to be made redundant, that the practice and the college can help the student in finding another position. It might also be that good practice to ask everybody else in the practice if they know of any other student positions available. But it is really important that we understand at what stage the student is in their studies, and liaison with the college as to what they might be able to help organise. It might be that you finished your exams, but you're waiting to complete assessments. And it might be that you can do that even though you're going to be made redundant. But it is open for negotiation, and it will vary from student to student. Okay, the next slide, please. When any redundancy exercise takes place in any type of organisation, it sends a shockwave through the whole business. And it is really important that people understand that it's going to be a difficult couple of months or a difficult couple of weeks. And even if you're not in the pool, people feel awkward, they feel unsettled, and it's okay to feel like that. So here we have a diagram of the Kubler-Ross change curve. This change curve is useful in any massive change in your life, whether that's a divorce, moving out of home for the first time, or whether it's at work. You might feel at point 1 that you thought redundancies were going to be announced, and actually it's a bit of a relief that now you know there are going to be redundancies. If you're the one delivering this message, if you're a practice manager or a business owner or a head nurse that's involved in this process, then you might feel relieved that the uncertainty of what's coming is now out in the open. And don't feel guilty about that, because you're holding a secret at the moment if you think this is going to happen and you're the only one who knows. We can expect at point 2, as we go down the mountainside into the boggy mire at the bottom, that people will feel shock, immobilization and loss, and a sense of numbness. People sort of begin to invert their feelings, and what we need to do is get people to move through this curve and feel supported. So if you're responsible for a set of redundancies, don't forget these points. The rest of the staff, the group that are not at risk, and the group who might be lucky enough to have their jobs at the end of this process, they need your support. And you need support if you're delivering this message. So at 3, we're searching for new ideas, and there might be some denial that the selection criteria are all wrong and the practice doesn't know what it's doing, or we don't agree with the process that they're going through. But we need to search through this whilst blocking the reality of the situation. At 4, don't be surprised if somebody becomes angry. An intense, all-consuming emotion. It could be anger. It could be, step 5, depression, self-doubt and inertia. And feelings of intense sadness, blame, guilt, and feeling tired and lethargic. It might be that you feel like that because your colleagues that you've got on really well with for the last few years, some of them might be leaving. It might be because you might be leaving. It's nobody's fault, this redundancy. At the moment, many, many redundancies are coming around because of coronavirus. Don't blame yourself for that. None of us could have seen that happening. What we need to get to is acceptance. The reality of the situation is finally accepted. We need to move on. We need to help our colleagues who won't be here tomorrow find new jobs, maybe through networking, maybe through their friends, their family, support your knowledge of the industry. Test those options. What's the feasibility and the realism that other options are out there? So what we need to move forward to is searching for meaning and self-awareness and accept the changes that are happening, whether they're happening to you and you're leaving the practice and looking for a new job. And what I will actually say at this point is we can help you with your CVs if you need any help. And if that helps any one of the members by filling in application forms or completing CVs, we'd be delighted to help you with that so that your self-awareness and your moving on can be done in a meaningful way. And then the people that are staying behind in the practice, they will integrate and renew their working figure and the adoption of a different way of working, But the people who have been made redundant, what we want them to have is a more positive lifestyle and look at moving forward in the new roles that they will undoubtedly find. So this whole Kubler-Ross change curve about supporting those people who are remainers is vitally important. It's also important that we support the people who are delivering these messages and scoring against the selection criteria. And it's really important that we don't ignore the people who are being made redundant. So often we find it embarrassing and difficult to talk to those people when what they really need is our support and encouragement as they move on to new roles. The next slide, please. This whole point about change management is vitally important. It's about morale, rebuilding the business, and announcing to everybody that the redundancy process is complete. On day one, when you tell a group of people that there are going to be redundancies at their place of work, perhaps their practice, perhaps their drug company, wherever it is, the first thing people do is think, what about me? How does this affect me? So everybody is on eggshells throughout this process, not sure what to say to somebody else, not sure who will be here next week, not sure who will be selected for redundancy, not sure how everyone's going to react. So announcing that the redundancy process is complete will help everybody through this change management process. If you're responsible for the redundancy decisions and responsible for the selection criteria, try and avoid lots of small redundancy processes. It's better to complete one exercise and have closure on that exercise than to keep nibbling away and repeating the process. Because by doing that, by repeating the process, all you do is cause more uncertainty for the future of the business and the people within that business. Much better, in my opinion, to do a larger redundancy exercise at the start, if that is what is required, than keep revisiting it, because morale will certainly suffer. And then we can help those people that are now without a job to move on and hopefully get them back into the workplace as soon as possible. Okay, so that is the presentation for this evening on the subject of redundancies, the legal position and processes. And if we go to the last slide, it does ask for any questions. It's quite a meaty subject. We do have a redundancy fact sheet, and I know that this webinar can be made available to people. It's been recorded, and also we have the handouts. But as with many of the subjects that I've covered over the last few months, this is very personal and is bespoke to the different practices and how they're going to deal with the redundancies and what they need the business to look like in the future. How you feel if you're going to be made redundant or considering perhaps volunteering, then again we can provide individual support. Today it's just an overview of the situation and how it might be handled. And just to recap, if you are currently furloughed or you have staff who are furloughed, you can consult with those people about a redundancy situation, because although they're not supposed to be working under furlough until we get to the flexi furlough, then this is not considered to be work. Consultation on redundancy does not form part of your day-to-day activity, and therefore you could be called into the practice to listen to the announcement even if you are furloughed, or to embark on one-to-one consultation with you if you're furloughed. So I'm going to hand back now to Wendy and Joe, who I know have been looking at the questions. Thank you for your participation. I know some of it's quite meaty and there's been a lot of information there, but please ask us any questions, and if you don't want to do that, live. We will, of course, be in the office tomorrow waiting for your calls. Thank you very much.
Thanks ever so much, Nikki. That was an absolutely fabulous webinar, really informative, with lots of information there. And as I'm sure everyone can see, certainly the way I did, it's a very tricksy situation and something that certainly benefits from individual conversations. So I do echo your sentiments as to getting in touch with the members helpline directly for more tailored in-depth information. We have had some questions come through. We may not be able to answer them all fully because some of them are quite dealing with personal circumstances, but we'll have a quick look. One case that's come through, someone decided to self-isolate due to being classed as high risk. They were finally furloughed after insisting on it for quite a lot, but after 2 months they were made redundant. They were the only person to be made redundant, and after just 20 days, they reopened the position. The person in question here thinks that might have been due to their health. Have you got any advice for that person?
I would certainly go back to that practice and ask why that job has not been made available to them. Let me just add to that, and I'll come back to the health issue. I think businesses often wait and see if things are going to improve before they make redundancies. And there's what we call the hockey stick effect. The business is going down, 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 the handle of the hockey stick, and then they might make changes and all of a sudden business picks up. And if that happens, and that's really not uncommon, they might have done more marketing, then another practice might have closed nearby, and suddenly you gain more work, then it is good practice that within a month to 2 months of letting people go under redundancy, that you offer them back jobs, and it's their choice whether they want to come back to you or not. They wouldn't have to repay the redundancy amount. Now, if this person was sick and was self-isolating, then if they were the only person to be redundant, I'd certainly be considering talking to them about an appeal about why they were selected, because they were self-isolating for a reason, and that was probably a medical reason. And so that might be covered by disability discrimination. And so we'd need to understand why they were perhaps shielding or self-isolating, what the situation was with regard to their health, how long-term that was, and therefore was it a disability, and why were they the ones selected. So as I said earlier, absence is not a good reason for selection for redundancy, because it might be because someone's got a disability, and selecting somebody because they've got a disability is not a lawful reason. Rather a long-winded answer, Joe, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. None of these things are as simple, are they? So that's why we have your expertise, thankfully. Thanks for that, and I do urge that person to please do contact Nikki and the BMAS team for some more advice there. Moving on to another question, we've got somebody who says they were the only person selected and no criteria was drawn up. They assume because there was no one else to compare that criteria to. Does that sound right, they're asking?
Well, it would depend on the reason. If they were the only, let's say, if they were the only specialist in equine and they weren't going to do any more equine work, then they're in a pool of one. But I would want to know what it was within the practice that made them make that business decision, and therefore was that the only person purely with those skills. So if it was a general practice and they were the only equine person, then they should have said that. It's not supposed to be a dark art. It's supposed to be completely open and transparent as to why that job will no longer exist.
Thanks. And so many of these things, so many of the issues we hear on a daily basis do come down to communication, don't they? And lack of communication between parties. So absolutely, if I was that person, I would be wanting to seek a bit more clarification with regards to, you know, like you say, why, what's the company's reasons for doing that?
Absolutely. And they can have a business reason for that. It might be that you were the only person who did the invoicing, let's say. if it was a small practice. But they need to say who else is going to do that invoicing instead of you in the future, and you're entitled to know that.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. One question that came through, I think we may have answered it, come through before one of your slides, but I'll just highlight it just in case. The person asks, if you are not in the at-risk pool, can you volunteer, which you've already said you can depending on the business, and could the practice refuse your voluntary redundancy?
Yeah, so just to recap, if you weren't in the pool, you can volunteer to go for your job to go into the pool and somebody else to be saved from redundancy. And the legal term, although it doesn't sound very legal, is called bumping. And bumping is lawful. So you can bump somebody out of the pool by volunteering. But it is up to the practice to establish who is an acceptable volunteer and who is not.
Brilliant, thank you very much. All this talk of pools is making me think of holidays that we can't have.
Probably not a good idea.
Not really. Okay, so final question that has come through then. If you were asked to be considered for a role which is very similar to the one you have, and you've been completing this role for 5 years, can you be screened and then subsequently told you are not suitable, despite exceeding expectations at your final appraisal?
Well, that might well happen, but I certainly would be asking for the reasons around that. If you met all of the selection criteria and you've been doing that job for the last 5 years, on what basis are you now not suitable? Now, if it was in a pool of one and they don't need that job anymore, even if you were brilliant, then I can understand that, that's the decision. But if you are not in a pool of one and you've been carrying out those tasks and they measure everybody effectively and do this 2 people assessment, then I certainly would be asking why. And that's your entitlement. Your entitlement is to appeal this. And it might be the difference between you keeping your job and not keeping your job. So, yep, don't be afraid to ask. Brilliant,
thank you. And absolutely, we need to use our voices and we need to fight for our jobs and our rights if we feel that things are not quite going as they should be. And certainly that the BV&A is here to help the members with that as much as we can. That's the end of our questions so far. My observations from the webinar, fabulous, really, really interesting stuff that you put up there, especially that selection criteria. I really liked that and thought it was a really fair and good way of doing things. And going back to the communication, a really easy to understand way of putting it, because sometimes some of these bits of paperwork with regards to redundancy can be very jargony, can't they, and a little bit intimidating to read. But I thought that criteria is very good, and especially good to hear that they cannot and should not use disability and illness in that criteria, as some of our members that have been watching have possibly been experiencing.
Absolutely. And I think, for anybody who's also on maternity leave or parental leave, there are a lot of protection for people in those categories. So if you feel that you are covered by the Equality Act due to any disability or long-term ill health is the definition. In employment law is disability. If you're on maternity leave, any of those things, and if they including past absences, and you've been, say, disciplined for those, they should not be double counted now. So that's very important that you bear that in mind.
Great, thank you. Well, look, we're coming to the end now. We've finished all of our questions. I would just like to say a really huge thank you, Nikki, for giving us your time tonight again. And also, as every day, you and your team working on behalf of the BV&A for our members helpline. And again, I just really want to strongly remind everyone that our members helpline is so useful for providing that targeted and individual advice to you. So please do contact us and get in touch. And obviously, if you're not a member, you do have the option of becoming a member, and you can be an associate member as well if you're not a veterinary nurse. So anyone within the veterinary sphere are welcome to join us and access our brilliant helpline. I'd also like to say a thank you to Wendy and Peter, who've been working behind the scenes tonight, keeping everything running. And thank you all for joining us, both on Facebook Live and on our Zoom webinar as well. If you have any further questions, please do send them to the email address that's on the screen. Alternatively, you can contact any of the team at BV&A HQ. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us this evening. Hope you will stay safe and well, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar. Thank you very much and good night.